and welcome to another episode of Born Psyched. We're going to continue with the topic of attachment, but this time we're going to be focusing on what we call the stages of attachment. Okay, hope you enjoy. And today's topic, as I said, is on stages of attachment. Now, in the attachment specification, this is the second of the topics. So let's have a look at exactly what this involves. As you can see, it's talking about psychologists Schaefer and Emerson, and it's their research that helped to generate the specific stages that we are talking about. So, as you can see, it is a case study carried out in 1964. This should be one of the first things you should start to think about if you wanted to evaluate. The examiners will say that you don't need to remember key dates. Now, this is true unless you want to think about evaluation. But I'll let you consider that in just a second. So, what they wanted to do was to look at very early attachments. Now, in future videos, we're going to look at how specific attachments form, including the ideas of primary and secondary attachments. But it's this particular research that sets the stage for that. So what they did is they looked at 60 infants. Now, sometimes we call this study the Glasgow baby study for very obvious reasons. So these 60 infants, obviously from Glasgow, coming from a specific working class. Again, this should start to give you hints about potential evaluation points. So, the babies and the mothers were visited by a psychologist who asked questions, who observed infants and mothers interacting with each other, and this occurred every month for the first year of a child's life, and then again 6 months later to see how the child has developed further. Now, mothers were asked different questions about their baby's behaviour. The two behaviours you can see listed there, what we call separation anxiety. This is where a child will show significant protest at being left alone from the parents, usually the mother. This could be the form of crying, you name it. And also stranger anxiety. This is the type of behaviour that a child shows when confronted with someone new. If anyone's ever seen a young child react this way, this is when they're met by someone new, and they'll often be very cautious, stereotypically, hiding behind their parents' legs, etc. So that's what they wanted to try and establish. They were looking at different behaviours. So in terms of their findings, what they suggested was that anxiety, both for separation and stranger, was its highest between 25 and 32 weeks. Now, this is a very significant time in a child's life. I'll get to that later on. But these findings were used to propose the different stages of attachment, which we're going to look at in just a few minutes. Let's get a closer look at the results first of all. Okay, so what we see here are out of the 60 infants, this is the number of infants who had developed these specific types of behaviours at the different stages. So we're looking at specific attachments, specifically to the mother, and then the idea of this fear of strangers, this stranger anxiety. Now, if you look here, as I said, between 25 and 32 weeks, the vast majority, in fact over half of the children, specifically for specific attachments and attachments to the mother in general, occurred within this stage. Now, if you translate this into months, this is around about 6 to 7 months in a child's life. Now, that 6-month period is really, really important. It links to what some people call the critical stage or critical period of attachment. But we'll get to that in another video. Now, if you wanted to evaluate, remember I've alluded to this already, you can focus on the date, but there are a number of different factors that you could look at. And the best way to remember these factors is to use the acronym GRAVE, or GRAVES in some case. Now, this stands for generalizability, reliability, applicability, validity, ethics, and sampling. Now, generalizability, it's a little bit misleading because this and validity could be linked. For the purpose of generalizability, this is our ability to understand how this situation can be generalized to other situations in the real world. Reliability is the extent to which the findings can be repeated. Now, this is often down to how controlled the experiment is. So if you're thinking about this, think about what elements might have been controlled, what weren't. As this was technically a field experiment, you could argue either way. You then have applicability. So are there any real-world applications for this finding? Now, when it's looking at things like parenting and attachment and some of the consequences that come from that, then applicability is often going to be very high. Now, validity in this term will refer predominantly to internal validity, which, like reliability, is highly dependent on how controlled the experiment was. The more controlled, the more internal validity, and vice versa, of course. Next, we have ethics. So, a number of different ethical issues that could come up, right to withdraw, protection from harm, invasion of privacy, etc. So you need to think about which of these will apply and what that means for the overall quality of the research. And lastly, sampling. Who was involved and how were they selected? Now, in Schaefer and Emerson's case, it was 60 infants, which is quite a small number, from Glasgow, so again very culturally specific, and all of whom were from working class families, again even more specific. So this then links back to this whole idea of generalizability. Okay, I'll let you come up with some more detailed ideas. Remember though, guys, when you are using evaluation, make sure that you elaborate fully and you understand what this means for the quality of the research and how that links to the theory in general. So, let's move on to the actual stages. The first stage is what we call the asocial stage. As it says there, this occurs within the first few weeks of a child's life. So very, very young infants indeed. Now, in this case, infants will respond almost indiscriminately to different objects. They can be animate objects, inanimate objects. They do respond to positive stimuli. Now, these inanimate objects can be anything from teddy bears to pets or security blankets. Now, last video we talked about this concept of reciprocity and interactional synchrony. It's during this stage, remember, in the very early stages of a child's development, that you begin to see this element, especially this interactional synchrony, this mirroring of behavior. And it's during this stage that we actually see this. Okay, the next stage is what we call the indiscriminate attachment stage. This is where the child begins to show a preference for more social interaction. Now, when we're talking about social interaction, this means that in comparison with the last stage, they tend to favour more human interaction and then can therefore discriminate between an inanimate object, i.e. a teddy bear, and their mother, and they tend to prefer human interaction. So this is the first idea of this understanding of child's social interaction. But we call it the indiscriminate attachment stage because a child doesn't show any specific preference for an adult in general. They will be perfectly happy seeking attention and support from pretty much any human around. And it doesn't even have to be the parents. But at this point, we talked about this concept of stranger anxiety. Children at this age do not show stranger anxiety. So they don't tend to react to different people. Remember, they are indiscriminate in terms of who they get this support and comfort from. The next stage is what we call a specific attachment. This is where the child has developed what we know as a primary attachment. And if you look here, it says the age of 6 to 7 months. Again, this number is very, very important in a child's development. So by this point, a child has actually have a preference for one particular carer specifically. Most of the time, that primary attachment figure will be the mother, although this is not necessarily the case. It's at this point that they also show separation anxiety. They don't like to be put down. They don't like to be left alone. So when they are put down for a sleep, especially if the parent or the primary attachment figure leaves the room, the child will at least temporarily begin to cry, things like that. Additionally, the child develops this stranger anxiety. They can discriminate between their primary attachment figure and anyone else, although this is less so for people who they've had regular contact with. Now, one thing that has occurred a lot in attachment research is this idea of primary attachments. Now, this tends to be the person who is usually most responsive to the child. Now, that does not mean that it's the person who will always see to the child, but more will understand exactly what the needs of the child are. You know, how parents will often say, well, I can tell that type of cry is a hunger cry, or that's they need their nappies changing cry, or they just want some comfort type of crying. Now, it says there in 95% of cases, the primary attachment figure is usually the mother. Okay, the last stage is what we call multiple attachments. This is this idea that the child now has this primary attachment figure, but he or she is supported by a number of secondary attachment figures. Now, who this is will often depend upon the child's social life, or the social life of the family, people who visit, etc. So, within this 1 month of them forming this primary attachment figure, round about 30% of all children have also developed a secondary attachment to someone else. Now, this could be to the father, to grandparents, to siblings, aunts and uncles, or close family friends who will visit regularly. And we're able to establish this because a child will show a degree of separation anxiety from these attachments as well. So, although it won't be as significant as separation from the mother figure, or father figure, don't get me wrong, the secondary attachments will result in the child becoming upset when they are separated. Now, let's move on to evaluating the different stages of attachment. For the purpose of this video, I'm only going to talk about 2 separate evaluation points for this. The reason being is that what we talked about earlier in terms of evaluating Schaefer and Emerson's research does actually count for evaluation as well. And depending how you would write an essay on something like this, the actual study used by Schaefer and Emerson depending on your phrasing, could be considered AO3 as well. But let's move on. So, remember, when evaluating, that elaboration is really important, and you remember the acronym PEAL because that's the best way to get really effective evaluation. So the first point, it is stages of attachment, which means it is a stage theory. Now, what stage theories normally say is that a particular stage or development will occur sequentially. So it'll be one point, then the next, then the next, then the next after that. And there are numerous stage theories in psychology. You're going to look at quite a few of them over the next year or two. The problem with stage theories is that there's a lot of contradictory evidence that suggests that life, in its infinitely complicated sense, does not occur like this. In this case, there is actually cross-cultural evidence to suggest that multiple attachments, what we would regard as stage 4, actually occurs before the child forms a primary attachment to one specific person. Now, this is often evident in a lot of Asian countries, Japan, China, for example, where they tend to put social needs above the specific individual needs. So you often found the child will develop significant multiple attachments first. What this suggests about this theory, however, is that it is incredibly simplistic and therefore reductionist. Okay, that's a very important term, so make sure you do remember that. Next, again, talking about cross-cultural evidence. Remember when we talked about where Schaeffer and Emerson's research was carried out? So, Glasgow. Now, obviously this is a very westernized particular type of culture. What we can argue, therefore, is that other evidence will actually show that behavior would be different in other cultures. Sagi et al. Study, forgive my pronunciation, infants raised in what we would consider a traditional family environment, parents, children, etc., twice as close to their mothers than children raised in more communal environments. There's a particular study we're going to look at in the future by Fox that looks at communal ways of raising children. So that would be one particular example. Now, what this means, though, is that Schaeffer and Emerson's stages might only apply to the specific cultures that they studied initially. What this means, again, use of key terms here, is that the research is heavily culturally specific. Okay, so we've looked at the stage theories with Schaeffer and Emerson's research and their subsequent evaluation. What we need to look at now is some exam questions. Now, what I thought I'd do now is look at a traditional application exam question. In the exam, you're going to get a lot of these that will often have what we call a stem. That's usually a paragraph or two of a specific, unique situation where you, as a student, will be asked a number of questions about them. Now, I'm taking this one directly from one of the core textbooks, specifically AQA Psychology for A-Level, Year 1, what a lot of people refer to as the green-haired girl book, for obvious reasons. So, if we were to look on page 77, we would see this particular application question. So, this is talking about separation anxiety. Now, because Schaeffer and Emerson studied Glasgow babies, the textbook often has to have this culturally specific reference here. So, Jock and Morag live with their son Tam and Morag's mother, who looks after Tam while Jock and Morag both work. Despite the fact that Morag works, she makes a special effort to sit and play with Tam when she gets home. When Tam got to the age of 7 months old, he began to get quite upset when his parents left for work. His grandmother tried to distract him and give him lots of attention. Now, there are two questions that follow that, but hopefully if you were paying attention, you would see that it mentions that critical period again, that age of 6 to 7 months. So that might be something you might want to refer to. So the questions here, referring to Schaefer and Emerson's stages of attachment, how would you explain to Jock and Morag why Tam's behaviour has changed? And the second question, based upon Schaefer and Emerson's stages, what could you advise them to expect from Tam's attachment behaviour in the future? Now remember, around about the age of 6 to 7 months, that's when the child develops this primary attachment figure, or in stage 3, specific attachments. So the child has developed this specific attachment to his mother, and everyone else is secondary to that one. They're not secondary attachments. In this case, the child only has a preference for the mother. So this is what you might want to talk about. The fact that when the child's mother, Morag, leaves the child alone, then separation anxiety occurs, so the child's going to cry. And they also develop stranger anxiety. Although you could argue this is less given the fact that there are other family members involved in this situation. The second question is talking about the stage 4, the multiple attachments. So the idea that Tam's father and his grandmother could become secondary attachments that become important in helping the child to develop. Remember guys, when you are talking about application questions, there is one golden rule. No matter how much you refer to correct psychological terminology, you must always, and I repeat, always refer back to specific points in that stem. It's like an English literature paper when you're doing your GCSEs. Always refer back to the text. Quote it if you will. Okay. Right, so hopefully you found this video useful. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave a comment. To be notified of any future videos, if you just click that subscribe button, I would be very grateful to hear from you. Otherwise, I will catch you all later. Hope the revision's going well, guys. Bye for now.